So, this is the last session of a conference which hopefully has not been too exhausting for you, and we move towards a period of late or later antiquity with two talks that will be given by, the first by Jan Opsoma and the second by Pantelis Golitsis, and in this way we will conclude the formal part of this conference. I do not need to introduce Jan Opsoma from the University of Leuven, who will present us his thoughts on scientific polytheism in the late ancient school of Athens, a topic that could not be absent from a conference like that. Professor Opsoma, we're looking forward to the talk.
Now, yes. Thank you very much. This will be on the late ancient school of Athens, 5th century AD. It will not be so much on philosophical doctrine or arguments, but more on the program. So, and there are two big schools in late antiquity, Alexandria and Athens, and I will compare them a bit and talk about scholarship on this. So it's often thought that the two schools differ considerably. Alexandrian, so Athenian Neoplatonists lost themselves in the development of ever more complicated hierarchies of divine entities, whereas the Alexandrians tended toward a simplified philosophical theology. And the reason for this difference is often believed to reside in a different attitude toward Christianity. Confrontational in Athens, more cautious in Alexandria. This was the view propagated by Karl Trechter. Then it has been criticized by Ilse Hadot, among others. Nowadays, few scholars would be willing to endorse Trechter's picture to the full extent, but there is, of course, a lot of it that is true. In a well-known book, City and School in Late Antique Athens and Alexandria, Edward Watts reconstructs the sociological and political elements underpinning the differences between the two places. And you see that on your handout number 1, a kind of nice summary. What he says is, Athens was a poor, sleepy city which possessed few industries besides its schools. It also had a relatively influential pagan population well into the 6th century. This meant that education was always a major part of life in the city, and pagan teachers had a degree of freedom to teach as they pleased. Alexandria, by contrast, was a major city with a diverse and vibrant economy in which education played only a small part. Socially, Alexandria was equally vibrant and diverse. The various Christian communities in the city engaged in vigorous and occasionally violent debate with one another, and with the city's declining yet still potent pagan minority. So in this analysis, the pagan philosophers were afforded greater intellectual freedom here in Athens, because the city was more provincial, less cosmopolitan, had a stronger pagan social network, political network, and was more exclusively focused on education than anything else. The existence of such a connection between the social political environment and philosophical teaching may be plausible, but there are no direct sources to show this incontrovertibly. A lot of the argument, Watts's argument for instance, remains speculative. Now in the writings of the authors like Syrianus, Proclus and some others, there are at best a few coded references to the Christians, no direct references. They have been examined by Persafre. I just accept his arguments, so I will not go into them with one exception. What I shall do is I shall look at the attempt to create a credible, scientific, in a sense, pagan metaphysical theology, and I will base myself exclusively on the texts of these philosophers themselves, insofar as we have them. And I will focus on Proclus, the main towering figure of the 5th century Athenian school, we believe that most of the system that we find in his work comes from his predecessor, Syrianus. So my question will be, what arguments the text provide to make this rehabilitation of the Hellenic pantheon credible to its followers? But let us first look at an excerpt from the rivaling school in Alexandria a century later. It is the passage that provides the clearest clue to the situation in Alexandria, I believe. So it's the text number 2. I will not read it completely, but so start. You must know that the philosophers hold that there is one principle of all things. And I think that all things means of the universe, of the visible universe. And one primary hypercosmic cause from which all things have sprung. This is a citation, we don't know exactly where it comes from, but we find it a couple of times. And to which they have not even given a name. They say then that there is a single principle of all things, but that does not produce the world here below without mediation. So there is mediation. For this would amount to disorder. That is, if we, so we humans, were created immediately by the first cause. And so it goes on a bit. He mentions some causes, some principles, and he says a few lines down, when they want to express them in words, they give symbolic names. So, now he addresses his audience, do not be confused by mere words when you hear of Cronian and Zeusian powers and such like, but think of the realities for which they stand. Think that we try to express something else by those words. If you like, so we think something else, the philosophers think something else, but you, if you like, you may take it that these powers have no essences, no ousiai of themselves, and are not separated from one another, so they are not distinct entities, but you place them inside the first cause and assert that in this first cause there are also intellective and life-producing powers, and so on. So I think this is a coded message in the Alexandrian school that can be used to address the audience that is in the first place the classroom, but possibly also readers, at two different levels. Those that are willing and able to understand the mention of different gods as indeed talking about different gods, and presumably also believing that these gods exist as distinct entities, and those who would not be willing to accept this, but could instead understand that the text and the myths in question reveal different powers of the one supreme principle in which they can be presumed to believe. Sorry, there's a small problem here. Yeah. First, so the author is Olympiodorus, so he says the philosophers think that. So the text is, I think, so vague that even specialists have been misled about what is said here. So the three translators think that what he's talking about is the first principle when he says the first of all things, and then talks about a hypercosmic God. I think that's wrong. I think he talks about demiurgy. So it's a much lower principle that is responsible for the creation of this world. This would explain the mention of Zeus, Kronos, life-giving principles, and so on. And also the use of the word hypercosmic. So you cannot use, I think, the text to show that in Alexandria they had a much more restricted pantheon, with the first cause being identical to the creator of the world. I think he is addressing Christians for whom indeed the creator of the world is also God. This is the view that that sometimes they criticize the Christians for, and that they think that the first God is actually just, so that what is actually just the creator of this universe is the first God. Okay. But it's a coded language to distinguish different layers in your audience, I think. So what the translators say, I quote a note in text 3, so Olympiodorus leaves it to his students to decide whether to call divine orders hypostases or attributes. His own indifference would be remarkable, but for the risk associated with trying to describe any particular degree of monotheism among Christians, and so on. In the text you will also find some precise remark pertaining to the Platonic view on causation. So the first principle, or the first demiurge, does not produce without intermediaries, because if he did, there would be complete disorder. So this means that according to certain Neoplatonic metaphysical principles, the order and hierarchy in the effects must be found in some way in order and hierarchy of causes. So, and if you put everything in one cause, this world would be a chaos. And the casualness with which here gods are named shows that the author is not interested here in the Hellenic pantheon, but rather in the metaphysical principles that determine the structure of the causal chains producing the world and everything in it. Even if you were to speak of these causal principles as powers, forgetting for a moment that they are in fact hypostaticized gods, the point about the structure remains valid. To that extent, conceiving of these principles as powers can be regarded as compatible alternatives. Now to Athens. Late Athenian Platonism as a distinctive branch, so with a specific way of doing philosophy, Platonism as we find it in the 5th century, actually migrated from Alexandria to Athens. The first of the late ancient Athenian Platonists that we know a bit about is called Nestorius, but we don't know much about him. Better known is a certain Plutarch of Athens. Actually, they're true, but better known is probably the grandson of this Nestorius. And we think that he refounded the academy and managed to attract several students from the east, among whom Hierocles, Syrianus, and Proclus, who had all studied in Alexandria. Their brand of Platonism was heavily influenced by Iamblichus, a distant follower of Plotinus, but someone who refounded again the whole, so diverged from Plotinus in many ways. So Syrianus then became the successor of Plutarch, but when he died around 432, maybe a bit later, he had led the school for only a few years. And then he was succeeded by Proclus. Now, according to Marinus, the biographer of Proclus, Proclus had left Alexandria because he was no longer happy with his teacher's interpretation of Plato. He was much more attracted by the direction the school had taken under Plutarch and Syrianus here in Athens. That's the next text, number 4. I will not read it in total, but so there is in the second part of that text. So he thought that the teacher held in his interpretation opinion that it was not worthy of the philosopher. And then he remembered a kind of revelation that he got where Athena told him, go to Athens, there you will find better philosophy. So whereas, and now a bit about the background, social background of these figures, Plutarch, Syrianus, Proclus. Plutarch was entrenched in Athenian high society by family ties. But Syrianus and Proclus were strangers to the city when they arrived. And this had serious consequences for the security of their position. Plutarch, as the progeny of an important Athenian family, appears to have been able, through his good relations with influential circles and his diplomatic skills, to propagate a form of Platonism that was wedded to the Hellenic pantheon without too many problems. This shows that when creating a new school or a new program, I'm looking to the left, it is of the highest importance to take good care of one's contacts and to hone one's diplomatic skills. But I've seen that that is pretty well secured here. Now, contrary to Plutarch, Proclus appears to have experienced serious problems in the beginning of his Athenian residence, and there are also suggestions of a brief exile, probably or possibly self-imposed. This may have been the consequence of his uncompromising and stubborn attitude. Later he became more cautious and gained political clout. For instance, when he had miraculously healed a young woman, Asclepigenea, the text, Marinus, his biography, first says, he hid this from hoi polloi, lest he give them any excuse for harming him. And this happened, the biographer adds, before the destruction of the temple of Asclepius. So we know that there were religious tensions in the city. And the reference to the many is a coded reference to the Christians. And I will now look at another text, one other text where you find something like that. Text number 5. So at first he talks a bit about disagreement, that this, what it means to disagree, what it means to agree, then he makes a syllogism. And then after the 3 dots he says there's something wrong with the middle term of both premises. Since not in every case are those who agree with each other on any subject knowledgeable about the topic on which they have agreement. So agreement doesn't mean they're right. And now comes the reference, for at the present time, the many agree that gods do not exist. So they are atheoi. But this has happened to them through lack of knowledge. And it goes on. So this is a clear, I think, stab at the many who have become atheists. So this is a text for beginners, in which the teacher, Proclus, explains, among other things, that there are many good teachers of Greek insofar as they agree upon the customary meanings of words, and so on, but then I will not, I'll skip this. So it's about, I basically already said it, so. But one thing that he mentions in the text, or hints at, is that contrary to the theology that these people have, there may be some kind of scientific theology. Epistemically and scientifically adequate views that he, and by implicature his pupils, hold. And it's to this scientific pagan theology that I will turn now. So I don't think I need to explain to you that the Neoplatonists believe that there is one supreme principle, the one. I will not say anything about that first principle, not only because it is ineffable, but also because I want to devote some more time to the doctrine of the Henads. Now it was Dodds, E.R. Dodds, who famously argued that this abstruse doctrine of Henads serves the purpose of reconciling polytheism with Platonic monism. That's text number 6. Huh? And then, so I will not go into the doctrine, but let me just say that Henads are participative manifestations of the one, so they are, in a way, functions of the first clause. There are many, they're equal in number with the classes of things, so of beings. They transcend being, they are unitary and good, and they are the gods in the most proper sense. That's what we find in the text. Each of these Henads expresses an individual character by which the one manifests itself and which can be known through the beings that participate in them. What is more, and now I turn to Dodds again, this doctrine constitutes an attempt to save pagan polytheism by transforming it into a metaphysical science about the gods. And let's look at 2 influential texts by Dodds that I gathered under 7. So Dodds says, there remains the theological side of the doctrine of the Henads, which Zeller and others regard as the really significant part of it. So Zeller thinks it's all about theology. It is certainly a singular example of the survival of an obsolete creed in mummy form, a mode of preservation which becomes possible only when the creed is already dead. The gods with whom the Henads are identified are, as we learn in detail from the Theologia Platonica, the gods of traditional Greek mythology, and the identification is no doubt to be understood as a last desperate attempt to carry out the policy of Iamblichus, whom I mentioned earlier, and maintain the united front of Hellenic philosophy and Hellenic religion against the inroads of Christianity. And then the last part, that Homer's Olympians, the most vividly conceived anthropomorphic beings in all literature, should have ended their career on the dusty shelves of this museum of metaphysical abstractions is one of time's strangest ironies. So I skip the reference to Zeller, that's a kind of correction. But Dodds's view that Proclus advocated a scientific theology, and he uses the word epistemonicae theologia, words that actually come from Iamblichus, in the guise of a metaphysical system in which Hellenic divinities are reinterpreted as abstract principles, finds many echoes in contemporary scholarship. So you can look at texts 9 and 10 where you find this view repeated. The combination of henotheism and polytheism is part and parcel of the system. It is justified by an argument that Proclus gives in the Elements of Theology, text number 11. Thus, if a plurality of gods exist, they must have the character of unity. But it is evident that such a plurality in fact exists, inasmuch as every originative cause introduces its proper manifold, which resembles it and is akin to it. So he's using metaphysical laws that he has established in the earlier part of the work to say there has to be a multiplicity of gods. So you can see the kind of, let's say, metaphysical explanation of this, and kind of argument. So I think that Dodds's thesis is more or less correct and very plausible. Now, one thing that should also be said, contrary to what we found in the text by Olympiodorus, Proclus insists on the distinct character of each of these gods. So they are separate entities, they are not attributes. Text 12, for instance, shows that. So what we have is a polytheistic metaphysics that was no doubt intended as a rival theory to Christian theology. I turn to another question, namely, how could a Platonist ever hope that a reasonable human being accept their metaphysical theological system? But this is, of course, an unworkable question, so I narrow it down to the question of the approach and the type of arguments used in the text that we still possess. So there are two works of Proclus that have the word theology in their title, the Elements of Theology, from which I cited, and the Platonic theology. These words are rather different in nature, as I shall say. And then there are many other works, commentaries, and others where you find theological parts, sections. What he does in the commentaries, for instance, first he gives the interpretation of the meaning of the text, philosophical interpretation, and then he says, now I'm turning to theology, and he establishes the equivalences between the names of the gods in different traditions, Orphic, Chaldean, Homeric, and so on, and says, okay, this principle is actually this god. So that's what he's looking at, with very detailed explanation. Now, what does a famous or well-known interpreter of these texts say? I turn to Stephen Gersh, text 13, and he distinguishes two ways, two sources of knowledge that are being used or appealed to in these texts. In a manner comparable with that of Christian doctrine already involved by his own time, Proclus' theology is based on twin sources of revelation and reason. So I admit that the dichotomy revelation-reason has some use. So you could tag different arguments and doctrines using these two labels. However, the situation is, I think, more complex. Let's start with reason. What is meant is the ordinary human capacity to engage in discursive reasoning. whereby concepts are combined in propositions and propositions are ordered in an argumentative structure in a way that does not contravene the laws of logic, is in accordance with these laws. These are then logoi, and the faculty that devises them and is in control of them is called dianoia, also logos. And the activity we engage in is discursive. We string together concepts and propositions, and this is done sequentially and in time. We could look at this faculty, dianoia, as something that is just a given, it just exists, it's independent. But this is not how the Platonists saw it. They believe that human reason can only exist because it depends on superior principles, namely nous, intellect, which in turn depends on even higher principles. There is an ontological dependence that is both existential and essential. Now we could retort that whether we believe this or not doesn't make much of a difference. But so the skeptic will say that the only evidence we have is the existence of reason, which seems to be able to function independently from any superior principles. But there is more to the view than this. Proclus and his fellow Platonists also think that not only the existence of the reasoning capacity, but also some of its basic contents is given by intellect. Some immediately, and some as structuring information that comes from the senses. Examples of the first would be concepts like one, many, whole, part, being, good, and also such propositions as the whole is greater than the part, or what is one is not many. And he lists them, and you find a number of texts where you see some of these contents being explained as common conceptions that come to us from intellect. So for Proclus, the human mind, both for certain of its contents and for its capacity to engage in logical reasonings, depends on intellect, which is its cause and in which it participates. Now, I will summarize the rest because I see we don't have much time left. The kind of argument that you find in the Elements of Theology is purely of this nature. It's purely discursive. It is a science, more precisely the science of dialectics. It doesn't appeal to any authority, and it contains no names of gods. In these other works, like Platonic theology, you find this second source coming in, the source that Gersh and others call revelation. Now, what can you already achieve without that second source? So what do we find in the Elements of Theology? Some very general statements about the God, metaphysical structures, no names of God, but a kind of basic hierarchy of principles with an argument, for instance, that says why being is prior to totality, or why parts are posterior to the whole, and so on. What is the eternal, what is eternity, and what relation do they stand at? And then in the other works, based on these other sources like Homeric text, Chaldean oracles, whatever, you then can, I will now turn to that, or Plato, you can now add names and make the picture more complete. How many? Few minutes?
Yes.
Okay. Then I will just say a few words about Plato. So we all possess this dianoia, but some people are more gifted than others. Plato is one of these very gifted people. So what you find is a lot of arguments telling you, or telling us, how sharp Plato was, how keen his mind was, but also how much he trained, and how, and even that he received some kind of what you could call a special revelation. Now these complexities can only be shown in the details of the text. So the complexity of Plato's mind shows itself in the complexity of the text and the many hidden allusions, and require the development of equally sophisticated exegetical tools and hermeneutical skills. This is basically what Proclus then does in these other works, whereby it's confirmed that Plato is invested with the highest authority in the domain of religion, but also in other domains. But here we talk about theology. And I want to conclude with one more remark about the Christians. So you have this building, marvelous architecture with all the different rooms and different elements that make the building a beautiful building, and somehow it's presented as being the plausible view of reality. But of course you need to worry about your opponents, and in this case they were the Christians. The Christians were now in power, and the fate of the Hellenic Platonic tradition depended upon their goodwill. Hellenic Platonism was at best tolerated, yet the period of relative toleration would soon come to an end. So Proclus could manage with his good contacts that he had built up in the city to be relatively unharmed, but later the later generations that became even more difficult. So this is the perspective from which Proclus's remarks about his own place in tradition should be understood. So he starts his work with a great overview of the Platonic tradition that culminated, as it were, in Syrianus, whose work then Proclus communicates to the world. Proclus sees it as his task to communicate what he has received from his predecessors, I quote, to those who will live later, in the form of hypomnemata of the blessed sights that they were allowed to enjoy, to admire, and to strive for under the guidance of their masters. Now the word hypomnema, which sometimes means commentary, here primarily evokes the notion of a memory aid. Proclus suggests that his writings and reminiscences of visions that he experienced can help those who are capable of similar visions to attain them, or to recall them once they have experienced them. So it's a plausible hypothesis that Proclus saw it as his duty to record for posterity a tradition that was then under threat, and that this amounted to producing a great synthesis of the tradition of wisdom bequeathed to him. And this may have involved putting into writing teachings that until then had only been transmitted orally. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Professor Opsommer, for this wonderful panorama in only 31 minutes. So we have another 14 minutes for discussion. Yes, please.
Thank you so much. Can you say a little bit more about the relationship between revelation and reason in Proclus? Because, of course, in Plato, to get the revelation of the form of the beautiful and the symposium, or the form of the good and the republic, years of careful dialectic study, very rigorous training, a lot of maths as well in the Republic. You don't just smoke a joint or drop some acid and get the form of the beauty. So does Proclus, forgive my ignorance, does Proclus sort of very intertwine, or does he show how you have to work for the revelation, or are they distinct methodologies?
I think they operate at very different levels. So there is, you could say, there is already revelation when you hear the word whole, or part, or good, and you understand what it means. So why do you understand what good is? Well, he thinks you know that because your Dianoia has access to nous, and that has access to the good as, and the top of it, so there is even a direct connection of, let's say, the summit of your soul to that. So, but that's very, very basic. It's something that everyone has. Then the revelation, in many cases, like in the case of Plato, involves a lot of study and work and so on. But there are other cases. So, for instance, the Chaldean oracles were believed to been transmitted in the spirit of the divine madness of the leaders. So there was this Julian who all of a sudden started talking and saying all these things about God. And then the other, but of course what they said was very hard to interpret. These texts are very obscure, so they are a revelation, but to make sense of it, you need, again, training and so on. So I would say it happens at very different levels, and you would have to look at the thousands of pages of Proclean text to see all these different things going on. And you see always different types, I would say.
So, Stelios, and you, Katerina, and Vaso.
Yes, thank
Please
you
be
for
as
that.
short as you can.
Yeah, in fact, my question relates to the previous question in a sense. You see, you mentioned Pierre Hadot at the beginning, and I've been wondering to what extent there are spiritual exercises in Proclus. I mean, prayer or some form of exercise which allows you to understand these metaphysical abstractions or render them somehow tangible in a way, or concrete, because Hadot, I know, uses the notion very widely for late antiquity, and I've been wondering to what extent you find this in Proclus.
So I would say that the Hadot I mentioned was Isotroud. But Pierre Hadot, indeed, in the wake of Pierre Hadot, people have tried to apply this model also to late antiquity and find more. I'm a bit skeptical about that. I mean, I don't reject it, but I think it's not omnipresent. Huh? But of course, you have commentaries that were written in the form of a prayer, where you start with a kind of invocation, you end with a kind of formula that ends the prayer. A text like Elements of Theology, this kind of dry, argumentative text based on the method of the geometers, so the manuals of geometry. Some people try to see that as well as a kind of spiritual exercise. I don't think it is. But there are other texts that have this nature, I think. And what is certainly clear, and I think that is the most important, philosophy was not just talking about text, it was living in the school and engaging in this communal activity of teaching and learning. Yeah. Please.
Yes, I know that what Proclus does is not considered many times seriously from the point of view of theology and philosophy. But what if he actually has a couple of interesting theological/philosophical points that he wants to make? Namely, one is that the task of philosophy or philosophical theology is, since the time of Plato or even before that, we know the Neveli papyrus and so on, what if it's a demythologization project? And we see that in the Christians as well. I mean, there are people like Origen who read the whole Bible allegorically, claiming that precisely the task of the theologian is to demythologize the narrative. So, and I'm bringing that in combination with what Gersh says, namely that it is, kind of revelation, but also the Christians do something similar to what Proclus does, namely to translate theological concepts into metaphysical concepts. The Contra Celsum again would be an example. So what if actually what this whole opposition from the point of view of Proclus and later Neoplatonists against the striving Christianity, what if it were to say that, what you are doing as Christians, we can do as Platonists. So actually what religion is about is in a way a language game. We can have different ways of talking about revelation and talking about God, and your way is just one way of doing it, and ours is another way of doing it. And I mean, that's an interesting point from the point of view of religion, namely that you can have different articulations of the whole of reality.
So I agree that there are many interesting philosophical and parts in Proclus, only I didn't talk about them today. But demythologization to some extent, but not in the sense that you would get rid of the myths, only that you would give an interpretation of the myths that gives some extra layer. Now, as to the relation of the, I do think that they were involved in very similar undertakings, but I also know that the people like Proclus and Syrianus didn't have great respect for what the Christians did. So they saw some very fundamental metaphysical truths. For instance, that your first principle is one, absolute unity. Christians didn't want to accept that. There is another big difference, I think, between. So what you see all these religious traditions being incorporated by Proclus into his metaphysical system. So what he did basically is he used Plato's arguments in the Parmenides to structure the whole metaphysical realm, and then attach the different names of the gods to the different stages of that realm. Now he could do that for the Orphics, he could do that for the Chaldeans, and so on. He doesn't do it for the Christians. So he could have done that. The thing is, according to them, Christians were not open to that. Christians had this claim that they had the only true religion. And so they were not open to do the same in the other way around. So they were not willing to say, okay, maybe you're right. But basically what he wants them to admit, what he can never admit, of course, is that their God is only a very minor, lower God in his pantheon. So that would be a bit too much, I guess, for them.
Katerina Ilieva.
Thank you very much, Jan. I like very much the fact that you reminded us that hypomnema is something that reminds us of something than what we call now commentary. But I was thinking, it was in fact a question that Angie asked yesterday for Porphyry. How much he thinks that he reminds us of what Plato says, and how much it is clear to him that he builds up a system which is quite away from what we find in Platonic dialogues?
That's a very hard question to answer, because there is no direct evidence that would allow you to answer that, I think. But for me, everything points in the direction that he really thought that his interpretation of Plato was the original intention of Plato. And you can see the painstaking work that goes into debating the meaning of a particle in this text or that to make a subtle theological distinction that can only be reconstructed using all the other sources available. So he had a Unitarian picture of Plato, who was the recipient of a great revelation and who has given it to us in a kind of coded form. The word is the words that are used have to do with ainitomai or ainigmata and so on. So he does see Plato as some kind of revelation of the truth, which makes it very different, I think, well, I'm sure, from the view of Plato that we have, at least, I would say, in the Western world, because outside the Western world you have views of Plato that are quite similar to what you here see.
I wanted to make, if I have 1 minute, some sort of a note, archaeological note, which is on, maybe you know it already, but maybe on Dionisio Areopagiti, you know, this road, there is the diagram of what is called the House of Proclus. But some of my colleagues who know better about these things, wasn't Proclus, it was what he inherited from Syrianus, what he inherited from Plutarch of Athens. And it's quite nice to see this diagram on the pavement, because you get an idea of how the house or the school or whatever it was.
But I hope
it would be better to see the house itself.
What was underneath?
I mean, it's a mistake that you cannot really see.
No, in
that.
fact,
It's an archaeological mistake.
What the archaeologists did at the time, because they didn't want to, because they wanted to have Dionisio Areopagiti, they said that they will cover it, and in the future, which is, I don't know when, they will do something with the glass on it so you can see it. But
I think that's a sound principle. So if you don't have the means and to protect it and to do it as you should, then you have to. Yeah.
The probably last question will be posed by Vaso Kindi.
Thank you very much. Could you say a little bit more about what scientific means in scientific theology? I mean, what is it contrasted to?
So it is contrasted to what so scientific, I use that for when words are used like epistemonique or dialectique. And that is the method that he applies in the Elements of Theology, for instance. This is a bit controversial, but it's my thesis that he considers this as a form of dialectic. That is to say, based on logical arguments, apagogic proofs, and so on. But also the method that he discovers or detects in Plato's Parmenides in the hypotheses of the second part. So he tries to show that the arguments given there are cogent and give a necessary structure of so what you can say if the one is, and so on, you know, all these things. So it's a play with arguments that I think most of us, none of us really understand what is going on, but Proclus claims to understand what it does, and so if I say scientific, I don't mean that it is, in our eyes, a science that is successful, but at least it has the ambition to give, many people use the word deductive, but I'm a bit afraid of that, but a kind of, I'm not afraid of deduction, but I'm afraid of using it in this context. But argumentative, yes. Strongly, strictly argumentative, but argumentative is also very broad, so it is logical argument, yes.
You use discursive, which I suppose.
Well, discursive, yes. But that's more the type of thinking in which this is then embedded, yeah.
So even if the premises, let's say, are from revelation, that would still count as scientific?
Yeah, for instance, I will give an example. If the beginning of the Elements of Theology is an argument in the first 4 or 5 propositions for the existence of a one that is nothing but one itself. And it starts with very simple notions like participation, whole, part, and it appeals to certain, so it appeals to our understanding of these words, and it appeals to certain principles like, or propositions, you could say axiomatic propositions, like the whole is greater than the part. Now the only problem here is that in the Elements of Physics, or the Elements of Theology, he doesn't speak in terms of axioms and so on, what we find in the geometric manuals. In the other works, I gave you some examples of them in the text, he explicitly says about such notions and such simple propositions that they have an axiomatic status for the study of theology. And what else? And that they come to us through intellect. So that we have an intellective, intuitive grasp of them. You can call that revelation. Your knowledge, he would call that, it is revealed to us that the whole is greater than the part, or that the one is not many. How do we know? Well, we just know because we are connected to intellect. On the basis of that, he builds his argument. And only on the basis of that, to reach the conclusion there must be a one, or that we first have a concept of a one that is nothing but one, and then the next step is this one exists. So, yeah.
And the Lisgolist will use 1 minute from his own time to ask the very last question.
Yes, thank you, Jan. Just a minor comment on your T2, this A-Boole manometer. The famous This is not, this doesn't have to do with risks associated, as Jackson says, etc. When this, the risks associated with trying to prescribe, etc. So the idea is simply is related to the fact that audiences in Alexandria were mixed.
Yes.
Well, you had both Christians and Greeks, Hellenes, and his argument there as well. Of course, I mean, any genuinely Athenian pagan student would never believe that, well, these powers are not self-existent hypostases themselves. So if you like, and this if you like addresses the Christian audience, you can say that, well, these powers are not self-existent, they are only powers, etc. And Olympiodorus' strategy is to keep both audiences in his classroom. And this is a big difference with regard to what was happening in Athens, where there were where Christian students were not admitted at all at the Platonic school.
But that is exactly how I see
that's
it.
okay. This is what I.
Sorry if I didn't communicate.
So,
Thank you.
Next. Dimitris Golitsis, no introduction needed either for him. He will present us his thoughts on Plato, or Plato, what it is to be an Athenian philosopher. And this has a PowerPoint, I think. Have you already uploaded it?
Yes, I have.
Oh, great.
Thank you for your presence and your patience. In his inaugural oration as Bishop of Athens, which he must have delivered soon after his installation in 1182, Michael Honyatis addressed the inhabitants of his adopted city with the following words. Such I hear were your founders of old, fond of learning, wise, forgiving, hospitable, humane, understanding, lovers of honor, generous, assistants to persuasion, servants of the word. If your race has been fastened to this golden chain, if the stream of succession is drawn from that source unsullied, if you are born not unworthy shoots of that stock, if you boast to be and be called native citizens of the best country, that is Athens, the coming time shall make known to me most clearly, and I shall quickly know the Attic blood and Athenian spirit, but not by the top knots and cicada brooches too. This is the Crovios and Tetins. This is a reference to Thucydides' description of the Athenians. Honyatis remained Bishop of Athens until the arrival of the Crusaders in 1205. This is here is his lead seal. You can read the Mitir Theou, Βοήθημη το Σόδουλο Μιχαήλ το Μητροπολίτη Αθηνών. It seems, however, that his flock, the native citizens of the best country, quickly disenchanted him. Already in his first catechesis, Honyatis was feeling compelled to address in desperation not his contemporary Athenians, but the city of Athens itself. «Ω πόλης Αθήνε, πού ποτέ αμαθίας περιέστης, ή της σοφίας τροφός». «O city of Athens, sphere of wisdom, to what point of ignorance have you come round?» Later on, he starts blaming himself. I'm sorry, I couldn't prepare a translation for that, but the Greek is not really hard to understand. I will read it, as the Byzantines themselves read Greek, and which is, it's really beautiful. «Εγώ μεν ίσχουν τη διάνοιαν και την γλώτταν παρέφυγον και προς ακροατάς Αθηναίων απογόνους, ενεγυμναζόμοι, ήτινες, λοιμώ ποτέ σποδρωτά το πιεζόμενοι, ουκ ηξίωσαν δανείσαστε παράτιμος ανδρός Αθηνιού, απεδεύτου δε άλλος και βαρβαρίσαντος, εν το υπήν παρά τους γραμματικούς κανόνας, εγώ ημίν δανειώ, ο άνδρες Αθηναίοι, αλλήλων το θανήν λοιμώ πρώτερον ή παραβαρβαριστού δανείσαστε, ως ουκ έχοντες πάτριον από βαρβαριζόντων τρέφεστε. So the ancient Athenians would die of hunger. There's a story that was known to Honyatis through Photius' lexicon, that, well, they faced the famine and they would rather die of hunger rather than take money from a barbaristes, that is someone who did not speak correct Attic Greek. And the idea here is that, well, the future tense of danizo in Byzantine Greek is daneiso, daniso, and not daneio, as this rich guy told them. And it's otherwise, it depends on grammatical canon. So therizo, which is more, will be therio, but, well, he didn't speak correct Greek. So they wouldn't take the money from someone who would use danio for the future tense of danizo. Τιού των ανδρών φιλολόγων από γόνους, ελπίζων έχει να κροατάς. Ίσχουνε με αυτόν ως ένι μάλιστα και προς το σοφότερον εδιαζόμην τι και ου και κομψευμένον, μη ουκ ανάξιος τροφεύς, τα εις λόγους τιάς δε φανίσομαι πόλεως. Αλέψε με των ελπίδων και της προσδοκίας εκπέπτωκα. But my hopes have been belied and I have fallen short of my expectations. Έναχος γάρ τα εισιτήρια εμήν προσδεξάμενος, σχέδια τεινά και απέριτα πάνηθη και αφιλότυπα, όμως εύρωξα μη συνετά λέγειν ή άλλος ομόγλωτα, άλλος από διαλέκτου περσικής ή σκυφικής. So his words were not understood by his flock, as if they did not speak the same language. A reference, I think, to the non-Greek speaking inhabitants of Athens. In Byzantine history, I mean, Persikos refers to Turkish normally, and Skythikos to Slavic. A couple of years later, Honiatis was totally unable to conceal his lamentation over Athens. These are some of the words that he publicly addressed to the imperial praetor Dimitrios Remis at the latter's arrival in Athens. This is also quite beautiful. Άγε δι τίνην ανδρών άριστε, τίμησον Αθήνας καταλύσας δεύρο, άσπασε το των λόγων έδαφων ο σοφός, την τους όλων ως μητέρα ο ενωμότατος δικαστής, την των ρητόρων και σοφιστών την φθηνών, ο της δημοσθενικής ηχούς εραστής. Αγάπησον ή που ίχνος της παλαιάς ευδαιμονίας, θεάσεω. Feel joy if you somewhere see a trace of the old eudaimonia. Μόνον επίσκες το δάκρυον, μη και την εορτήν ποιήσεις ανέορτον, but retain your tear, so that you do not render the feast unfestive. Ορόγα ως ουκ αδακριτή βλέπεις Αθήνας. Αλλά και αυτό το της πόλεως σχήπα και την όλος εγγράφουσαν τες πόλες η μορφήν και κατάσταση. Οράς τύχη τα μεν περιηρημένα, τα 10 θυρημένα παράπαν, οικίας 10 καμένας και γεωργουμένας. Οράς την μακράν ερημίαν μικρού και αίκητον, ούτω βαρβαρικότερον των Περσών ο χρόνος της αγαθής επεξήλθε της πόλεως, δεινό συμμάχο το φθόνο χρυσάμενος. Ούδε ρήπιον γουν ηλιέας ή περιπάτου, ηλικίου έβρισαν πλήστα καμό. No matter how you try, you cannot find even a ruin of Iliea or the Peripatos or the Lyceum. Μόνον ανίδης πετρέων αρίου πάγου γεόλοφο, the Acropolis, ουδέν όφασιν ιερών, ότι μη στεφάνιν πέτρας ψηλήν, και μόνο το σεμνό γνωριζομένην ονόματι. Τυχόν δε τι και της ποικίλης στοάς μικρών λείψανων, μιλόβοτων και αυτό. Sheep were grazing amongst the ruins of the painted colonnade in which the Stoics once taught. Και της οδούς του χρόνου τα σπλήνθους παρατρογόμενου. Ούτω μουσε μεν και χάριτες, αυτή φιλοσοφία και αυτή σοφιστική της Αττικής εξαπέπτυσα. Αγρικία δε και βάρβαρος φωνή ταύτην κατεκληρώσαν. Thus the Muses and the Harites, here are they, the three graces in the fresco from Pompeii, have flown away from Attica. Rusticity and barbaric language have taken their place. This is how a very learned author of the Middle Byzantine period pictured to himself and left to posterity medieval Athens. He has also eloquently said, "Ve barbarome chronios on en Athinas." I have become a barbarian now that I am a resident of Athens. And he has also said, "Ikon Athinas, uk Athinas vlepo." I live in Athens, but I see Athens nowhere. By the end of Byzantium, however, things get drastically changed. In a letter written shortly before the fall of Constantinople in 1453, Giovanni Antonio Campani, a poet and later a protege of Cardinal Bessarion, records his experience of being taught by Dimitrios Chalkokondylis, who was a native of Athens. A Greek, he says, arrived to Perugia from the new, as they say, academy. This is the Florentine Academy. He was so filled with erudition in Greek and Latin literature, as he was with humanity and prudence. He began to teach me firmly, and I listened to his precepts with incredible pleasure, because he is Greek, because he's an Athenian and because he is Demetrius. It seems to me that in him is figured all the wisdom, the civility and the elegance of those so famous and illustrious ancient Greeks. Merely seeing him, you fancy you are looking on Plato, far more when you hear him speak. And well, this was our modern Greek pronunciations of Greek. And here it is, the revivified, Plato. Unlike the medieval Athenians, to Honyatis, Chalkokondyllis appeared to Campani as a revivified Plato. Chalkokondyllis later moved to Milan, where he died in 1511. This Athenian teacher was famous all over Italy. The Venetian printer Aldo Manuzio addresses Chalkokondyllis in the preface to the first printed edition of Euripides, that is 1503, by saying to him that he gets consolation for the fact that ancient Athens does not exist anymore, because, I quote, "you alone represent for us Athens with your wisdom." Of course, such eulogies were part of the reinvention of Hellas by Italian humanists, to put it with the words of the title of a recently very good book recently published book by Han Landers. A new generation of Italian scholars wished to liberate itself from medieval scholasticism by having the sentiment of dueling at Plato's Academy or Aristotle's Lyceum. Through the teaching of and their acquaintance with Greek scholars such as Dimitrios Chrysoloras, Ioannis Argyropoulos, Ianos Laskaris, Dimitrios Chalkokondyllis and others, the Italian humanists wished to restore ancient Hellas, and in their restoration, Athens had a prominent place. In his lecture on the Expositio of Homer, which he delivered in Florence in 1486, that is at the time at which the Italians were becoming independent of Greek teachers, the famous Hellenist Angelo Poliziano addressed his audience with the following words: "You are the people, Florentines, in whose city all Greek learning, since long extinct in Greece itself, has come to live again, and flourishes so greatly that your men now already teach Greek literature in public, and boys of high nobility speak the Attic language so soundly and so easily and fluently that it would seem that Athens had not already been destroyed and occupied by barbarians, but had spontaneously pulled itself from its very soil and immigrated to Florence." Nonetheless, the rehabilitation of Athens was not an Italian idea. It did not even start in Renaissance Italy. Michael Apostoles, a mediocre philosopher, but a prolific copyist and forger to some extent of Greek manuscripts in Crete, manuscripts that were to be sold to Italian Hellenists, writes in his discourse on Hellas and Europe, Λόγος περί Ελλάδος και Ευρώπης, that even if he and his likes were, I quote, the remnants of the Hellenes, τα λείψανα των Ελλήνων, they were still superior to their Italian peers. This was because Athens alone, he says, had produced more philosophers than the whole of Italy could ever bring forth. But one should not forget that the Athenians were Greeks, as Greeks were Apostoles and his likes. It seems that by Apostoles' time, the race had been refastened to the golden chain of the ancient Athenians, to recall Honyatis' words. Also in Constantinople, the capital of the falling empire, Athens was becoming all the more important. In his encomium to his native city Trebizond, which was written between 1436 and 1440, with the purpose of encouraging the Trapezuntines to protect their freedom against the Ottomans, who finally incorporated Trebizond into their empire in 1461. Bessarion proudly claimed that the Trapezuntines descended from the Athenians. Trebizond, he says, boasts that the Attic city of the Athenians is her first beginning and metropolis, the rearer of the Hellenes, the mother of literature, the teacher of this most beautiful language, that is Attic language. The people of Sinope colonized it, whom the Milesians, colonized by the Athenians, had in turn colonized. For Bessarion, the golden chain of the ancient Athenians never broke. It is just that Choniatis went to the wrong place. Later on, Bessarion puts forward the state of freedom as the most characteristic feature of the Hellenic spirit and flesh. They, the Trapezuntines, showed immediately from the start that they were Hellenes, a people without master, unenslaved and uniquely free both spiritually and physically. They imitated their forebears, the Sinopeans, the Milesians, and earlier still, the Athenians. The ideal of freedom, as characteristic of the Greek spirit, is of course related to Plato's Timaeus. In the introductory part of this dialogue, Critias narrates to Socrates and to Timaeus a story that he heard from his homonymous grandfather, who had heard it from Solon. Carol mentioned that passage as well yesterday. An Egyptian priest told Solon that 9,000 years ago, an extraordinary power grown up on an island outside the Mediterranean, namely Atlantis, attempted to enslave Greece and Egypt and all the region within Gibraltar. But the power of your city, said the priest to Solon, was made manifest to all mankind in its valor and strength. It vanquished the invaders and set up her trophy. The peoples not yet enslaved she preserved from slavery, and all the rest of us who dwell within the bounds set by Heracles she freed with ungranting hand. That was Confucius' translation. Now, as Bessarion's encomium was written before his acquaintance with any Italian humanist, it allows us to see that his Athenocentrism was independent from the Renaissance reinvention of Hellas. Chalcocondylis, Apostolis, and Bessarion have a common element. They were all pupils of George Gemistos, alias Pletho. It is, I believe, through their acquaintance with Pletho and thanks to the latter's influence that they all developed a sense of historicity and Hellenic cultural superiority. Pletho is well known for his revival of Hellenism. In his address to Manuel, the Byzantine emperor, written around 1415, he famously proclaimed, "We, whom you lead and rule over, are Greeks by descent, Hellenes to Genos, as our language and paternal culture show." But as if Pletho was familiar with Choniatis' lamentation over the barbarized Athens, he regarded Peloponnesus, not Athens, as the cradle of Greece. He further explained to the emperor that there cannot be any country for the Greeks to live in other than the Peloponnese, where the Greeks had lived since time immemorial. So apparently he was familiar with ruins, etc., that he was seeing in Peloponnese. As the Athenian Ionians were for Bessarion the forefathers of the Trapezuntines, the Peloponnesian Dorians were for Pletho, through consecutive colonizations, the founders of Constantinople itself. Evidently enough, the philosopher of Mistra had put all of his hopes on the Peloponnese as the only Greek land which, once politically reformed, would secure the survival of the Eastern Roman Empire. Thus this mean that unlike his pupil Bessarion, Pletho was not Athenocentric but only Hellenocentric. Well, he was surely Athenocentric in matters of philosophy. As is well known, on the occasion of the Council for the Reunification of the Churches, which took place in Ferrara and in Florence from 1438 to 1439, Pletho, who was a member of the Byzantine delegation, was asked by Italian scholars in Florence to develop his claim that Plato was far superior to Aristotle. This led to the publication of his On the Departures of Aristotle from Plato, a text which, as he himself says, was written as a sort of consolation during a short period of illness and for the sake of Plato's followers. As such, this work was restricted to the most principal of the philosophical doctrines and to what could be accurately said against Aristotle. It was later, that is when Pletho went back to Mistra and composed his response against George Scholarius' objections, that his full account of Aristotle's inferiority with regard to Plato was fully developed. Now, there are many interesting things that Plato says against Aristotle and against Scholarios, but within the present context, one should particularly retain our attention. For any Platonist, or any Christian, or rather any monotheist thinker, the basic flaw of Aristotle's philosophy is its denial of an efficient cause, a productive cause, for the universe. This means that Aristotle posited his first principle, the nous or noises noisios, only as a cause of the motion of the heavens, and not also as a cause of the existence of the heavens. Since Plato had pointed this out in his On the Departures of Aristotle from Plato, Scholarios tried to counteract it through various strategies. He claimed that Aristotle posited his first principle not only as the final, but also as the efficient cause of the universe, although he did not explicitly state it. The reason for this, according to Scholarios, was that Aristotle was interested in proving the eternity of the world, and by positing the cause of this eternity also as an efficient cause would have sabotaged his argument, since people usually think that whatever has an efficient cause has been produced in time. Besides, Scholarios argued further, even Plato was not clear about the eternity of the universe, as Plato was claiming. If Plato had been clear with regard to this, Aristotle would not have said in his topics that one of the matters, the problems in the dialectical jargon, for which no true arguments had been laid down by his predecessors, was whether the universe is eternal or not. Why should one expect explicit statements in matters which are hard to understand by the majority of people? How can Plato argue a silentio that for Plato the universe is eternal and at the same time blame Aristotle for not saying anything about the efficient cause of the universe? In his response, Plato claimed that one cannot be seriously asked to believe that Aristotle, who was a pupil of Plato for many years, did not know that both for the Pythagoreans and his master, the universe was eternal. His saying the opposite was only a sign of his maliciousness, kakourgia, a standard accusation against Aristotle since the time of the Neoplatonist Syrianus. Aristotle wanted to assert the sublime hyperiphanos doctrine of the eternity of the universe by maliciously confounding the thesis that the universe has a cause of its existence with the thesis that the universe has been created in time. Plato, however, as any diligent reader of the Timaeus and the Phaedrus should know, distinguished between what is generated, geneton, by way of cause, which is true of the soul according to the Timaeus, and what is generated by way of time, which is not true of the soul according to the Phaedrus, where it is explicitly said that the soul is ungenerated and immortal, ageniton te kai athanaton. Should one then blame Plato for his unclear use of the word genetos, and generally for his diction? Aristotle, Plato says, would be the least appropriate person to speak of clarity of expression. Aristotle cannot justly blame Plato for his diction, a philosopher who was both an Athenian and superior to all Greeks in accuracy of speech. He, who was both a Stagirite and felt quite short of Plato in accuracy of Greek speech. The crucial point here is not about Aristotle's failure to achieve clarity in his writings. Aristotle's obscurity, asapheia, was notorious in antiquity and was sometimes positively judged, as for instance by Scholarios, who speaks of the, I quote, the obscurity fitting to the sage, to appropriate for the sage, to asaphes sopho prepon. Unlike, he says, Scholarios, the fancy language of Plato, which is fitting to a poet. The crucial point is about Aristotle's congenital, so to speak, inability to acquire accuracy in Attic dialect, because he was not born and raised in Athens. Here is how Plato counteracts Scholarius' distinction between obscurity appropriate for the sage and obscurity supplicatory. How does obscurity of diction befit the sage? Is it not more appropriate for a slave who does not yet have a clear command of Greek, or for a sophist who does not feel certain of what he says and disguises it through the obscurity of his diction, or for an envious person who puts an impediment on his readers so that they may need him to explain his thought? How can obscurity of diction befit the sage, who out of his humanity should make the deepest meanings as intelligible as he can through the clarity of his diction? Remember that Sophia and Philanthropia, wisdom, humanity, are the qualities that Campani ascribed to the revivified Plato, that is Demetrius Harkokondylis. There he speaks of Harkokondylis' humanitas and prudentia. One further argument of Scholarius in favor of Aristotle's silent belief in an efficient cause of the universe is an argument by analogy. He says that one can hardly be persuaded that Aristotle posited the heavenly bodies as causes not only of the change of sublunary bodies, but also of their existence, and at the same time hold that the cause of the heavenly bodies themselves, i.e. Aristotle's God, causes only their motion. Here is Plato's response. On the contrary, it is much harder to be persuaded that Aristotle believed that God is the demiurge of the heaven, but did not mention it anywhere, and that this is true, while on many occasions the context required him to mention it, if indeed he believed it. You claim that he rejected this very name, that is the name Demiurgos, demiurge, but you can hardly persuade us that he only rejected the name, but not also the meaning of the name, a name that Plato has used. Plato, who is far more Greek than Aristotle and more accurate than him as regards diction. Now, Aristotle defined in his rhetoric to Hellenizing in an absolute way. Hellenizing is the clarity of expression, to safes des lexos. For Plato, however, speaking Greek, Greekness comes in degrees and not in an absolute way. Plato is Ellinikoteros than Aristotle. Because of his non-Athenian origin, Aristotle does not have the right to blame Plato for applying the name Demiurgos, which seems appropriate only for human beings, and what is more, appropriate for a lower class of human beings. Apply this name to God. You cannot blame Plato for that. If Plato used this word for God, then this word should not be applied to craftsmen anymore. This is how it should work, not the other way around. Christians, of course, would be happy to follow Plato on this point. God is the only true demiurgos, the only true demiurge. Although Aristotle defines Hellenism, for Plato, he did not meet with his writings the criteria that he himself set. Although from our point of view, Aristotle preserved with a plurality of the unmoved movers of the celestial spheres, the genuinely Hellenic polytheistic spirit. For Plato, he only put forward a deficient metaphysics. For he did not have, unlike Plato, a concept of a supreme God, Father and Creator of everything. A concept that, according to Plato himself, was not a Greek invention, but originated in the most ancient philosophy of Zoroaster. Interestingly, this account is in sharp contrast with the strategy of some of the last Hellenes of late antiquity, especially in Alexandria. I'm thinking of Ammonius, son of Ammias, who sought in Aristotle and his arguments in favor of the eternity of the world the best ally in their battle against the new religion. But this, I trust, is hardly surprising, for it is one thing to defend Hellenism and quite another to try to revive it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pandit. In time, you were in time. a bit of surprise to many of us here, but it was great also, so thank you. Yeah, 15 minutes for questions. Yes, good evening.
Thank you very much. I have a small question. One, is it possible that United Life knew of Harmonious? I suspect no. Saying that the final, that Vancouver is not only the final call, but
Of course he knew it.
he knew it.
Of course, through Simplicius. Not.
Did he use it in his argument?
Yes, he does. Yes, yes.
I have no idea. The second question about the text you showed about Demetrius.
Alvacondilis.
So he says that because he is a Greek, because he is an Athenian, because he is Demetrius.
Yes.
And I was wondering, how do you understand because he is Demetrius?
It regards his personality. So I mean, the best. I mean, he is Greek, which is far more important than being Italian. Then it's not only Greek, it could be a Stagirite Greek, but he's not a Stagirite Greek, he's not a Greek from Stagira, he's a Greek from Athens, which is fantastic, and then he's the person I know, Demetrius. So, I mean, he was acquainted, he was his teacher.
That was my first reading, but then I wondered whether he could have been thinking of another Athenian called Demetrius, who was not a Platonist, but he was very important because he wasn't very pathetic, so he was the founder of the Library of Alexandria. Could he be
I have
thinking
not-
of another Athenian called Demetrius?
I don't know, I'll think about it. Yes, well, but, I mean, he was not so famous. I mean, could Campani be acquainted with, but I don't know, I'll think about it. So you're thinking about Demetrius Phaleres?
And another famous Athenian who, from Athens, went to Alexandria and was the founder of the library. So there's another Demetrius now who comes to Italy. And it is a kind of correspondence. There's a kind of correspondence there.
Yeah, maybe. I'll think about it. It's a good suggestion. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Thank you so much. So my limited knowledge of Renaissance humanism is sort of really about Ficino. But I'm interested in this, the word, that the clarity of speech in Plato is because of his humanity. So I'm trying to grapple with the notion of Renaissance humanism, which was, they thought they were sort of building that from the ancient Greeks, but then they come up with a Renaissance ideal of humanism by which they then go back to the ancient Greeks and judge ancient Greeks according to how well they live up to their ideal of Renaissance humanism. Plato makes the grade, Aristotle doesn't. So I'm grappling with this. There's a really interesting, they're very, very selective in which Greeks they're using to build up Renaissance humanism based on the Greeks. Am I anywhere close?
Yes, I think that this is correct, yes. And of course, I mean, this idea of clarity of speech was for humanists particularly important. I mean, they wanted to get rid of, for instance, scholastic Latin. I mean, they wanted to write a different kind of Latin and who would be close and helped by their knowledge of Attic Greek, because they considered that Attic Greek was the best form of Greek language. So this is the argument, but the idea is that, well, that this sort of thing of Attic, of Athenocentrism, I think that this started, that was my point already in Byzantium, and particularly in the Peloponnese, I mean in Mistra, where Pletho's taught.
I would also ask a small question. I mean, those people arguing about whose texts are more clear, Plato's, Aristotle's, etc. Do they also reflect on the different status of the Aristotelian texts themselves compared to Plato's texts?
No, that's a problem. They are not, because
They are
absolutely.
not, okay.
I mean, Aristotle, as I said, defines to Hellenism. I mean, speaking Greek as the clarity, so it's to safes, and apparently he made use of that criterion, and he was up to this definition in his published works, in his dialogues. I mean, there is this famous testimony by Cicero. But the treatises were intended, I mean, for internal use within the Peripatos, but, well, they do not make such distinctions.
Okay.
No, no. Yeah. But they, I mean, Scholarius has an argument which is quite interesting, which is funny. He says, well, well, I believe that there was a book that has been lost where Aristotle, a book from the metaphysics that originally belonged to the metaphysics but has been lost, and there Aristotle must have said clearly that,
yes,
that there is an efficient cause of the universe.
Okay. Good. Yes, Katerina.
I was quite puzzled by the title when I read the title, because usually you connect Plato with Mistras and not
Yes.
with Athens. And I was wondering whether you are going to present more evidence of what he thinks of Athens, the city. So does he make any comments about Athens?
No, he does. I mean, the only thing is, this is why I contrasted Plato with Bessarion. So there is this narrative by Bessarion. I mean, those people are, I mean, they are familiar with that, with the Greek history, of course, with all the sources, and they bring up, I mean, this idea about that Asia Minor and Constantinople itself were colonies of ancient Greeks, from Peloponnese, from Megara, etc. And it's Bessarion who is really Athenocentric, because he thinks that he's a descendant of the Athenians, because he was from Trapezoid, etc. But Plato speaks only, I mean, in his discourses, his letters to the emperors, either of Mistra or of Byzantium, he speaks of Peloponnese, and he thinks that, well, this is, and I guess that was a good idea, because it was, I mean, even politically, geographically, strategically, that was the place where Byzantium could continue to live. But, well, there is this kind of, I take that, well, the title is a bit provocative, but this Athenocentrism concerns only diction. I mean, Plato, who was an Athenian and spoke correct Attic Greek, which is the language that should be taught in the revived Byzantium.
I mean, that's frivolous what I'm going to say, but I wonder why some people from Peloponnese these days, like Panasas, who think that Greece is Peloponnese. They should take him as...
They are with Plato, yes.
Okay.
We are with Aristotle.
No comment. Yes, please.
Thank you. Follow up. I apologize for my ignorance, but could you please say a little bit more about Ammonius in Gennavius Polarius?
I mean, this is, I mean, the story is about Ammonius having written a treatise which has not been preserved, on in order to rebuke Alexander. I mean, the problem with Ammonius, the problem was Alexander of Aphrodisias, who, to my mind at least, has correctly told that, I mean, the first principle, according to Aristotle, is only a final cause of the universe. And I think that this is correct. That was Alexander's position. And of course, I mean, then Aristotle get criticized by later thinkers, because he somehow posited a plurality of principles, and he does not show how these 48 or 56 movers are coordinated, etc. But I think that what this is, he did not have to argue for that, because for any ancient Greek thinker, I mean, it was quite obvious that, well, there were many gods. I mean, the opposite would be strange. I mean, if you have just one god, as in the Abrahamic religions. And, but the standard peripatetic interpretation was, as I said, that of Alexander of Aphrodisias, and then Aristotle is being criticized by late Platonists on the basis of this authentic interpretation of Alexander. And Ammonius sees, being in Alexandria, that, well, with Plato you cannot do much work against Christianity. This is my conception of the story. Because, I mean, he's not you can read the Timaeus as saying that, well, the universe had a beginning in time, etc. Whereas you take physics 8, you take metaphysics lambda, you are great, you teach those texts, and you can have arguments against Christian claims that in favor of the creation of the world in time. So he wanted somehow to rebuke the Platonists, the late Platonists themselves, who had downgraded Aristotle. And he wanted, because when there you could have a Platonist student who would say, well, you know, I mean, okay, it's fine, Aristotle, but Aristotle is not as good as Plato because he does not have an efficient, he has not posited an efficient cause of the universe. So he wrote that treatise in order to rebuke, to reject arguments by Platonists so as to upgrade, so to speak, Aristotle and put him on the same level with Plato. And this is the story told by Simplicius. Simplicius tells to his readers, well, go read Ammonius's arguments, but the treatise has not been preserved. But those people like Bessarion, like Scholarios, like Pletho, had literally read everything. So Scholarius knew that through Simplicius's commentary.
So my question was, did he know that through Simplicius' commentary, or is it possible
No.
that it was not preserved?
No, absolutely not. No.
How can we know that it was not preserved? How can we know?
If
There's no reference anywhere?
If that treatise was preserved in the 15th century, I mean in the time in which Scholarius lived, I can assure you that we would have, yes. So it's, no. Practically, we have preserved whatever the Greeks wrote. I mean, all the manuscripts written after the restoration of the capital in Constantinople in 1261. I mean, the manuscripts that were used by Paleologan scholars have been practically preserved. Yes.
So, a brief last question, please.
Thank you, Professor. My question is that it seems that in the circle of Mithras, being Athenian equals being philosopher or being scholar or historian. Do you think it's correct? Because if I understand well, when Plato talks about being Athenian, it's more in a symbolic way, because in reality, Athens was, if I'm not wrong, under
Ottoman rule, yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
So it was a
yes.
Latin, Frankish state. We know that in ancient times, sometimes being Athenian means being philosopher. For example, in the case of Clement of Alexandria, even if we don't know exactly his origin, but he's called philosopher, so we can suppose that maybe he comes from Athens or has
this is correct. This is correct, but I think that Plato's point is that, well, Plato was indeed an Athenian in the proper sense. And that was important because, being an Athenian, he could use correctly the Attic dialect. That's the point. And this idea that, well, this restored empire in the Peloponnese should use only the Attic language.
Okay.
So I mean, it's literally meant.
But still, in the circle of Mithras, for example, in the case of Chalcondyles, is also called Chalcondyles, the Historia Athenia.
Yes, this is Laonikos. He's not. He's his brother.
Yeah.
Laonikos.
So you would think it was also in the literal way. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you.
So, Anelis, thank you.
Thank you.
it's time to close this conference. You don't expect big words from me. I first of all want to thank our secretariat, our volunteers, without whom this conference could not have taken place. We have only two of them here, I think. Vana Sakelari, please stand up. And Konstantina Moula in the back. Mr. Fassois has been recording us for 1.5 days. Thank you very much. You will receive an email from me in the next hours or days asking for your permission. It might be a good idea to upload this all, but only if you agree with that, and those who agree with that. So we'll be very careful, of course, and ask for your permission. And
thank you, Panagiotis.
yes.
Thank you. Many thanks to the participants who took this long way to come here with us. If you somehow feel that this new MA is worth spreading the word, please spread the word, and there is some material here as well. You can take it with you if you want for your universities, etc. Thanks for being here. Thank you.